What's going on, boys? It's Salted Neos here. I wasn't really expecting the last video to blow up out of nowhere like it ended up doing, so I think the best way to celebrate the success of that video is to go over the very topic that led me to that video's information in the first place. So today we're going to begin to answer the question, how many shiny Pokedex entries are possible to register in Pokemon Home? Before we get started, I'll go over what the rules for this are. First of all, our goal is to get this counter in the mobile version of Pokemon Home as high as possible while the form filter is set to shiny Pokemon. This effectively gives us a counter to go off for this, and it also requires all forms of a Pokemon to be registered as well. The Switch version does have a tracker as well, but it's lacking forms, so it's not as interesting in my opinion. Plus, when I did this casually, due to a glitch we'll cover near the end of the series, my counter on the Switch version was desynced from mobile. And to this day, I'm still missing a shiny entry on Switch that I have on mobile. As a result of this, I don't really trust the Switch's less featured Pokedex. Second, of course, is no modifying any of the games we're using, editing their save files, or modding Pokemon Home or Bank directly. I feel like this one should be pretty obvious. However, I'm going to allow glitches, as to be honest, there's nothing that's known that would make more available, as the first games we'll be discussing have something far more powerful, which allows anything obtainable through glitches to be gotten anyway. Lastly, we're only going to be counting entries which you could still get right now. I'll be mentioning past event Pokemon or raids which don't have any alternative at the end of the series, but I think the goal should be to answer how much one person could get on their own if they were dedicated enough and only just started. Don't worry though, I'll have a total with and without those Pokemon at the very end of this series. With all that said, let's get started. We're going to start with the earliest Pokemon games you're going to need for this, and those games are Pokemon Ultra Sun or Pokemon Ultra Moon, where we'll be getting the vast majorities of our entries from, and that's thanks to our old friend the QR scanner. The QR codes are by far the easiest method of obtaining a shiny Pokedex entry, since it's just 10 free ones every day thanks to the fan-made QR pack that I discussed in the last video. If you want more details on how that works, I'd suggest checking out the last video. Because you only get 10 scans a day though, having more Generation 7 games to scan more QR codes each day is very helpful. I'd recommend at bare minimum having both Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon though, for reasons we'll get to in a bit. I might as well add that I've gotten a few comments from people having trouble with the QR codes from the QR scanner not registering to Home. While I unfortunately can't test this for myself because I don't have a Home account without a complete dex to transfer to, I have a feeling the issue might be that you don't have the Pokemon as caught in either Home or Bank yet, since the QR codes are only registering a Pokemon as seen. Since covering every single QR code Pokemon individually would make this a 2-hour video all on its own, I'll be splitting the count for the QR code mons by region, then discussing anything noteworthy in each region. In addition to that, just for fun, for the mythicals of each region where there's at least one option to obtain them without using a cheating device, I'll be going into some of the methods to obtain their shiny directly instead of just using their QR codes. The methods I cover may be some cool glitch that directly gets the shiny, a glitch that sets up their shiny hunt, or just some way that the shiny is still normally obtainable. Let's kick things off with Kanto. We need to scan 139 of the original 151 Pokemon's QR codes. We could skip out on Venusaur, Charizard, Blastoise, Butterfree, Pikachu, Cantonium Meowth, Machamp, Gengar, Kingler, Lapras, Eevee, and Snorlax, along with any of their Mega forms. All of these Pokemon have Gigantamax forms, which means we're going to need to get the Pokemon at some other point to deposit into Home for the Gigantamax shiny entry to register. There are also 28 alternate forms for Kanto that we need to register in addition to the 139 regular Pokemon, and those are for each of the Alolan forms and the Mega Evolutions for the Pokemon we didn't exclude. As I mentioned last video, the Cat Pikachu QRs don't scan properly and instead scan as a regular Pikachu, which means unfortunately that we can't get those by QR scans to our current knowledge. We also don't need to scan the totem-sized variant Pokemon, as after Generation 7, they're not considered alternate forms anymore, and even if you transfer in a totem-sized variant Pokemon, Pokemon Home resizes it to the normal size. Mew is notable for only having a few ways to be registered outside of its QR code. If you wanted to hunt a shiny Mew totally legitimately, you'd either need the old C map, which was only ever distributed for Japanese copies of Pokemon Emerald, or to do the no longer available Masterwork research in Pokemon Go. For those of you who don't want to use this QR code, but do want to get it shiny by any means possible, you have a few options. Pomeg glitch shenanigans in Pokemon Emerald can just warp you to Faraway Island to hunt it there, among other things. And for those of you with a Generation 1 Virtual Console release, you can also use arbitrary code execution to create one to transfer up as well. With all of Kanto's scanned though, we've got ourselves a total of 167 Pokemon. Moving on to Johto, there's no Gigantamax forms or forms introduced after Generation 7 that require us to put these Pokemon into Pokemon Home, so it just makes sense to scan all 100 regular Johto Pokemon. If you're really tight on QR scans though, you can save Quilava and Dunsparce till the very end, as you're pretty likely to have to catch them at some point, though catching them isn't technically mandatory, so I'm gonna count them for the QR scans total. Hisuian Typhlosion appears in Massive Mass Outbreak sometimes as a spawn, which would bypass Quilava, and Dunsparce is, complicated? So the easiest way to get a shiny 3-segment Dunsparce is either by RNG abusing for one with a Hardy Nature and Serene Grace in either Gen 3 or 4, or by Pokeradar chaining for one in a Gen 4 game while it's swarming with a Hardy Synchronizer until you get one with both that nature and Serene Grace, as having that nature and ability combo makes the PID end in 0-0, and guarantees a 3-segment Dunsparce upon transfer. This only applies to Dunsparce caught in Gens 3 and 4 though. Unless we end up with a way to get one a little easier in the Indigo Disc DLC, currently saving Dunsparce's scan for later makes sense, as even ignoring past generations, you still more than likely have to catch at least one, and probably many more than one shiny Dunsparce for that entry. Johto also has 33 alternate forms, which are for its Mega Pokemon and the other 27 unknown. Celebi, like Mew, only has a few ways to be shiny hunted for those of you who don't want to scan its QR code. The most obvious method is of course using the Virtual Console release of Pokemon Crystal to do it as a regular shiny hunt. There's also a special research that was out in Pokemon Go when the Zaru movie was new that gave out a shiny Celebi that could be transferred. Generation 2 also has several glitches that can just generate any shiny Pokemon, either through the daycare or through the coin case. Unfortunately though, since there was never a way to legitimately get a shiny Celebi within Generations 3 through 5, any Pomeg glitch shiny Celebi attempts are blocked by Poketransporter, so unfortunately we can't use the cool Fire Red and Leaf Green Pomeg Daycare Hunt method. With the 133 from Johto though, we've got 300 shinies registered and we can move on to Hoenn. Like with Johto, there's not really a reason to not just scan all 135 of Hoenn's regular Pokemon and its 28 alternate forms. The alternate forms are for all of Hoenn's Mega Pokemon and Primals, along with the forms of Castform and Deoxys. Speaking of Deoxys though, it's another Pokemon you probably just want to scan. It's not as bad as Mew and Celebi since it occasionally pops up as a raid boss in Pokemon Go, but because it is a raid boss in Pokemon Go, it's only for limited times, and assuming you don't get it in your free raid passes, or just live in an area where Go isn't super popular like I do, it'll cost you real money for every remote raid you have to do. Like with Mew though, some variant of Pomeg shenanigans can also get you to Deoxys, either by just popping one into existence, or by warping to Birth Island. Speaking of Birth Island though, people have actually managed to recreate the Birth Island distribution, meaning you can play out the event as if it was the real thing from back in 2004. If you haven't seen that, I suggest checking it out, because it's pretty cool. As for Jirachi, like Mew, it has a Masterwork research for those of us who played Hoenn Tour. If you don't have that, but still really don't want to use a QR code though, there's always the Coliseum bonus disc, or the PAL release of Pokemon Channel, that you can either use to shiny hunt or RNG abuse it in. There's also probably some way to use Pomeg glitch shenanigans to get a shiny Jirachi, which you can transfer through Transporter just fine. With Hoenn's 163 shinies done, we're sitting at 463 shinies registered, and we can move on to Sinnoh's QR codes. For Sinnoh, we're only going to be scanning 105 of the 107 regular Pokemon in the region, as Dialga and Palkia are required to be deposited into a box directly later on for their origin forms to be registered. There are also 36 forms in Sinnoh that need to be scanned as well. Those 36 are the other 2 Burmy Cloaks, the other 2 Wormadam Cloaks, Cherrim's Sunshine form, the second Shelosian Gastrodon, the 5 Sinnoh Mega Evolutions, the Rotom Appliance forms, Giratina's Origin form, Shaman Sky form, and the other 17 Arceus types. Gender differences in Pokemon Home are only required when they make the 2 genders have a significant gameplay difference, so Hippopotas and Hippowdon, 2 Pokemon I immediately think of whenever I think of gender differences, aren't required to have both genders scanned. On to the mythicals of this region, we're starting with Manaphy. For Manaphy, if you wanted shiny Dex entry and didn't want to scan for it, you're going down the rabbit hole of probably one of the single worst shiny hunts in the entire history of the series, and I wish you luck with that. I'm sure we all know how bad the Ranger Egg Manaphy shiny hunt is, so I don't think I need to go into more detail. It's RNG abusable, and even that is really tough since you only get one chance per copy of Pokemon Ranger without using some tool to totally reset the save data on the cartridge. I've done this RNG before, and yeah, it did take me multiple attempts, which I had to restore a backup of the egg for, so mad respect to anyone who does this without some sort of safety net. For the other mythicals in Sinnoh, Darkrai is by far the most accessible of them, as it can be obtained through Pokemon Go as an occasional raid boss, or through the tweaking glitch. But make sure you level up Darkrai to at least level 50 before it's sent to Gen 5. I've also heard being caught on Diamond is apparently a requirement, but I'm not really sure how valid that claim is. Shaman and Arceus aren't as lucky. Both can be gotten through the tweaking glitch, but can't transfer through Pokemon Bank to my knowledge, as Pokemon Bank's hack checks are really weird. Shaman makes sense for why it can't transfer, as it's missing the Fateful Encounter flag if caught in Diamond and Pearl, which is the same reason it can't become Skyform if caught in those games. I have no idea what the consensus on Arceus is, though. Shaman can also just be caught through the Surf glitch in early versions of BDSP, and Arceus can be hunted on later versions of BDSP if you have Legends Arceus completed on your Switch profile. Shaman and Darkrai are otherwise obtainable through Platinum's version of their events, as they had a real release there. However you decide to deal with the Sinnoh Mythicals though, you end up with 604 Pokemon after you're finished with Sinnoh. Next up is Unova. In Unova, you'll want to scan 155 of the 156 regular Pokemon available in the region. The one exclusion in Unova being Garbodor, as it has a Gigantamax form. Though you can push off Dewott and Petalil until the very last scans if you want, since they're very likely to come up with Legends Arceus for their Hisuian evolutions. There are also 20 alternate forms in Unova to scan, those being Mega Audino, each season of Deerling and Sawsbuck, the other Basculin, the Therian Genies, Black and White Kyurem, Resolute Keldeo, Pirouette Meloetta, and each Genesect drive. Again, like with Hippopotas, despite Frillish and Jellicent's significant gender differences, they're not treated as alternate forms. You can't really get around having to scan Keldeo, Victini, or Meloetta though, as Gen 5 hasn't been broken wide open yet. Shiny Genesect is occasionally available in Pokemon Go though, and no matter which drive you catch, it's able to transfer in just fine. Otherwise, it's just a really old Japanese event, or you're screwed out of Genesect and have to scan it. With everything in Unova scanned though, we can add another 175 to our total, giving us 779 shinies registered so far. For Kalos, we're going to want to scan everything with just a single exception, so all 72 of its regular Pokemon and 54 of the 55 alternate forms. The form we're skipping is Eternal Flower Floette, since it was never officially released, even in its regular variant, and as a result it doesn't have a Pokedex entry in Pokemon Home. The other 54 forms in Kalos, though, are Ash Greninja, each pattern of Vivillon, every other flower of Flabebe, Floette, and Florges, each trim of Furfrou, female Meowstic, Aegislash's Blade Stance, each size of Pumpkaboo and Gourgeist, Xerneas' Neutral Mode, and the other two Zygardes, Mega Diancie, and Hoopa Unbound. There are a lot of mandatory scans in Kalos, and not even all of them are mythicals. If you don't have the incredibly rare event Shiny Diancie, there's no other option for it or its Mega, unfortunately. Meanwhile, Ash Greninja, Pokeball Pattern Vivillon, Hoopa, Hoopa Unbound, and Volcanion have never been released as shiny Pokemon. With all of Kalos scanned, you should be at 905 Pokemon. Finally, we're into the home stretch of the QR code section with Alola. As I stated in my last video, unfortunately not everything in Alola has a QR code for whatever reason, and as a result we're only scanning 63 of the regular Alolan Pokemon. Dartrix can be saved until near the end thanks to Hisui and Decidueye if you want to do that. There are also 30 alternate forms which need to be scanned, those being the other 3 Oricorio, Midnight Lycanroc, Wishy-Washy School Form, each type of Silvally, each type of Minior, and Busted Mimikyu. You might have noticed I skipped Dusk Lycanroc, and that's because its QR code doesn't work properly. Like Cap Pikachu, Dusk Lycanroc scans in as a regular Lycanroc for whatever reason, though this one is a lot more understandable seeing as the form got introduced in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. The Pokemon we can't scan in are all the Pokemon after Kommo-o in the Pokedex, so all the legendaries other than Type Null and Silvally, all the Ultra Beasts, and all the Mythicals. Unfortunately, none of the Mythicals are shiny huntable in these games either, as the Magearna gift is shiny locked and the other 2 aren't obtainable without an event. The legendaries I mentioned are also all shiny locked in these games, so they can't be hunted at least in Generation 7. This, however, does wrap up all the QR code Pokemon finally, giving us a grand total of 998 shiny entries to work with without having to catch a single shiny. Like I said last time though, if QR codes for Cosmog, Cosmoem, the two Magearna, and Marshadow are ever generated by someone who has the means of doing so, that would be the only way to get those 5 entries without directly modding your games. Now that we're done with the QR codes, we're going to start discussing which Pokemon are needed in each game going forward, starting with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, as there are Pokemon in these games which can't be scanned that are still necessary to get. The most obvious one, ironically still being tied to the QR scanner in some way, is Partner Cap Pikachu. As I discussed in the last video, Partner Cap Pikachu's Shiny Lock is faulty due to its preset trainer ID giving it a different trainer shiny value or TSV than yours. Because of this faulty Shiny Lock, there's a 1 in 4096 chance that the Shiny Lock is functioning properly, so I suggest hunting this on at least 2 games if you don't have the means of confirming your save file's value will work. This Pikachu doesn't look any different, and as far as I'm aware is still a full odd shiny, but it is a Dex entry and it'll add it to our total once it's obtained. The other ones are not technically required here, but are both way easier to hunt in this game compared to any other, and one of them completely removes an entire set of games from being required. The first set of Pokemon to hunt here are all the Ultra Beasts. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are the first Pokemon games where the Ultra Beasts weren't shiny locked, including the new ones. There are 10 Ultra Beasts to hunt in total between both versions, and all of them except Poipole are thankfully affected by the shiny charm if you have it. Poipole being a gift Pokemon is unaffected by the shiny charm, which, honestly, until doing research of this video, I thought was a change in Generation 7, but apparently has always been the case. Regardless, it's really annoying. If you were playing back in the day, though, you might have gotten this mystery gift shiny Poipole, and if you do, you're saving yourself a tedious hunt just by having it. Because of how home transfers entries from Bank, you don't even have to evolve the Poipole in the later game to get both entries, so I'll be counting Naganadel here as well. With all the Ultra Beasts though, you can add 11 more shinies to the total. Finally, for the last shiny hunts in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, you want to hunt Dialga and Palkia in the Ultra Wormholes. This is the main reason you want both Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, as having both of these means you don't need BDSP whatsoever, unless you really wanted to hunt Arceus. Each of Dialga and Palkia will count for 2 Pokemon as well due to their origin forms, though they may need to be deposited into Legends Arceus then back into Home for the entries to register. We'll just count them here since we're getting the Pokemon now. With the first batch of actual shinies for the run, we're sitting at an insane 1014 shinies registered to the Dex before we move into a Switch game. I realized in editing I should probably mention these Pokemon from X and Y's Friend Safari, as the Friend Safari is also a decent way to get shinies and is about to become a lot more tedious to use without online friend codes. These Pokemon are noteworthy because they're normally required to get for their Gigantamax entries at some point, so definitely worth bringing them up. They are Ivysaur, Charmeleon, Wartortle, Butterfree, Pikachu, Machoke, Krabby, Eevee, and Garbodor. Of course, you still need to get Gigantamax Factor on these mons, but Max Mushrooms exist, so it's very easy to do that. I won't add these to the total, as I want to keep this to a minimum number of games, and more so, I want to keep as many of the games on the Switch as possible. But for those of you who have X and Y, it might be worth grabbing these. With the 3DS era of Pokemon games covered, I think that's a pretty good place to leave off for part 1. In part 2 of this series, we'll get started on the Switch era of Pokemon games, starting with Sword and Shield. While I originally wanted this whole thing to be one video, I forgot when I started this that shiny hunting in Sword and Shield is sorta slow, and so I want to minimize as many things as possible that would be required to get there. As a result of that though, I need to see which Pokemon appear in the Indigo Disc DLC, as just with the info we have as of now, there are quite a few Pokemon which become infinitely easier. Because nothing is ever going to be easier than the QR scanner though, and the fact that it's somewhat on a time crunch, I figured it was better to get this part up and seeing if there was any interest in covering the rest of this once the Indigo Disc is out. With all that covered though, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Later on, boys.